now we will look at some art movements in the early 20th century Europe. In the early 20th century, we witness a sort of a process where artists would come together and work together by sharing ideas and by sharing resources. And Paris becomes a center, as we could see. Paris becomes a center in by the late 19th century, and through Impressionism itself, we could see that artists were working in collaboration. There were these efforts of collaboration and sharing and discussion about what kind of work, there was a kind of a space, a discursive space for the artists to come together and work in a sort of a shared space. And late 19th century Paris provided that shared space, and it became very active, and we can see that artists have been coming from outside, in the sense not only from France, the different places from France, but outside from France also. They were coming here in Paris, and Paris was really the center of culture, art, and politics. So let us look at some art movements, and the important art movements that I enumerated in the beginning, and see what kind of creative space that got opened at this point of time, right? Another point, or several points that one needs to keep in mind, is the technological innovations, right? They were happening, and in the context of architecture, this RCC, reinforced cement concrete, was invented, and that really led to revolutionize architecture, right? So why I am saying architecture in this context is, architecture gets a sort of a geometric nature at this point of time, a sort of a geometric cubistic language of design at this point of time. And also because of the RCC, because of the cement, the design got revolutionized, in the sense one can think the designs, abstract designs, that could not be possible before, right? So this is one of the important points that one needs to keep in mind. So let us move to an art movement called Cubism. Pablo Picasso, who was a Spanish, and Georges Braque, a French artist, came together and experimented, which could be called later as Cubism. But before getting into the actual Cubist or defined Cubist works, let us begin with this image that you have on the slide, on the screen, which is 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧 𝗚𝗧 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧 was completed in 1907. And it's a very important painting. It's a remarkable painting that sort of defined modernist painting in the 20th century. It is the beginning of 20th century, and with this painting really revolutionized the way artists have imagined painting, the approaches towards painting. So what you see in this image is 5 nude figures, and they are arranged in multiple angles. As you can see, in the center you have 2 figures facing the viewer, 2 figures in the front, right, the frontal posture, and on the left side you have 1 figure which you can see from the side, and the opposite figure on the extreme right is like who is removing the curtain and trying to come out from the curtain. So you have these different angles. The figures are painted from different angles, and you have 1 figure which is seated on the right side, right bottom, right? And if you just take this particular figure which is sitting, and Picasso took over 2 years to paint this particular painting, in which underwent a lot of analysis, underwent a lot of research, and erasure and repainting. And if you look at this figure that is sitting, if you look at it, it appears as if the back of the figure is shown, right, for us. But when you look at the face which looks like a mask, which doesn't look like a face, but the face is frontal, right. So, the body is shown from the back, but the face is shown from the front, right. So, here the early emergence of the logic of cubism could be seen. The logic of cubism is fundamentally the multiple perspective, right, representation based on multiple perspective. Unlike, let us say, the Renaissance perspective, that which defined the compositional structure on painting till this particular image, till the post-impressionism. What happens here is artist is using different perspectives in one painting. He is not using a linear perspective anymore, but he has deconstructed, he has kind of broken that, and then he is using multiple perspectives. Like, for example, the figure is seen from the back and at the same time the face from the front, right. So, you have two perspectives, one is from the back, one is from the front. Likewise, you can see all these figures, like if you look at the center figure, the very center figure, which is, whose arms are lifted up, the leg is put forward. If you look at it, the figure is appearing as if she is sleeping on the bed and somebody is looking. The artist has taken that viewpoint from the top, right. So, if somebody is lying on the bed and if you are standing on the ground and you are looking at it, you cannot see this entire frontal portion, frontal angle of the figure, right. So, what here Picasso is doing is, he is combining multiple perspectives into one painting. It is not something that is seen from one particular angle, but multiple angles, multiple perspectives that is seen, that is used to see the reality. They are combined together and this painting is the result. And he did several kind of plans, sketches of this particular painting, of this for this particular painting, and this is what finally we get to see. And the composition looks quite conventional, where the figures and the drapery, if you go back to the neoclassical times, you will see figures and drapery in this sort of a combination. This looks like sort of a theater where figures are kind of displaying, and you have a still life in the front. Again, still life is also a conventional genre, right. So, this painting is just the beginning of something that is going to come, which is called cubism, right. And look at the faces here. Picasso repainted the faces, at least the three faces, the two figures on either sides and the seated figure. So, this is the time artists were collecting different kinds of artifacts, and African masks and sculpture were very popular, and Picasso had African masks and sculptures in his studio. He referred to them, he studied them. Matisse had, and several other artists were kind of collecting them. They were kind of borrowing from the ethnographic museum, the municipal ethnographic museum, because by the 19th century, European cities were flooded with non-European artifacts, the Japanese fans, Japanese screens, other kinds of Japanese prints, and the African sculpture, the Indian crafts and Indian sculpture. So, you have the European cities were kind of flooded, where different kinds of antiquarians, different persons who were interested in these artifacts, they brought, and there was a huge market here at this point of time. So, Europeans knew different artifacts of the non-Europe, and this is one important point also. Modern art had been influenced very closely by the non-European artifacts. That may be Japanese art, African art, or Asian art, right. So, Asian in the sense Indian also. So, you have coming back to this painting, Picasso actually had in his studio African sculpture and African masks, right. So, after studying African masks, he sort of used that influence in this painting. So, you can see the figures on either side and the seated figure looks different, right. They are painted like mask-like faces, right. So, this painting was a revolutionary painting, at that point of time, and which opened up a lot of possibilities, creative possibilities for the artist to think about painting, right. When Picasso painted this, people could not accept, his friends laughed at him. He had hidden this painting. He didn't show this painting. He had hidden this painting for at least 2 years, and only later he disclosed it, shared it with few friends, and he didn't get a very encouraging response. It's only later it got a popularity and it became a very important painting, right. Let us move to the next slide. So this is also Picasso again. So this is an example where this is the head of a woman. This is the mask. On the left side is the head of the woman, and on the right you have a West African Dan mask. So if you know, these masks and sculptures in Africa had ritualistic significance, right? They were part of rituals. They were not art. They were religious objects. They were used in ritual dances and ritual activities. But when it comes to the modern artist, what modern artist is doing, like Picasso, is they are taking this particular sculpture or mask away from the ritual, right? A sort of a decontextualizing, they are dislocating the object. And for the modern artist, this is just a matter of form, right? There are no other meanings for Picasso in this particular mask like an African would have, because for an African, this mask is something related with their ritual. Like for example, the Indian deities, Indian sculpture is part of the ritual practice, part of praying, right? That may be any Indian, whether it is a Shiva, Nataraja, or you have Ganesha, or you have any other sort of a Indian mythological sculpture, in the Indian religious sculpture would have a sort of a religious significance for the people in India, for the Hindus in India. They would pray. It's not just a matter of sculpture, it's not just a matter of art, but when it went into the museum, it becomes art, right? So this is a sort of an interesting question. But anyway, coming back to Picasso and the modern art, for modern artists, all the other objects of ritual significance in their own context, like African mask in this context, for modern artists, all these meanings does not exist. They approach it in terms of a form, right? So the geometric character that you see here, the geometric character of African mask really attracted most of these European artists, and particularly Picasso and Braque. So they have drawn certain formalistic methods, formalistic influences to use for their painting. So this is a result. This is one of the examples, and you can have several examples like this. So the woman's head on the left side is painted influenced by this particular mask, and Picasso used, and you can see in the 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗧 𝗹𝗶, that painting also, he's using the formal effect, formal structure of these masks and sculptures in painting his own figures. So as we go ahead, and you can see this is the next slide, where he painted this slightly before his encounter with mask, right? So this doesn't quite look like a mask, but there is, he already entered into a sort of a stylization, right? Before getting into Cubism, he almost invented Cubism. Before inventing Cubism, he was painting in the period called Blue period and later Pink period, right? He was a very struggling artist and very prodigal sort of an artist. So he is credited for Cubism, and because Cubism is a revolutionary sort of a visual language. And why Cubism? We'll see why Cubism little later. So he used to paint, you can see a sort of a simplification, a sort of a stylization happening in this particular image. The way the eyes are painted, the simplistic treatment of the nose and the mouth. So when he was doing something like this, he encountered African masks, and Henry Matisse introduced Picasso with African masks and sculptures. So he right away sort of had taken those influences into painting, and you can see 𝗬𝗎𝗁𝗎𝗍 and other paintings were the result. So let us move to the next slide of not Picasso but Georges Braque. Georges Braque was part of a Fauvist group. A group was formed at this point of time, 1906, which the movement that they started was called as Fauvism. So Braque was painting in the Fauvist language. We will see about Fauvism little later. He was painting something like this, as you see on your screen. He was very much influenced from, inspired and influenced from Cézanne's painting. And in 1906, you can note this date, 1906, Paris had a huge retrospective exhibition by Cézanne of Cézanne's works. So in that really impacted many artists, Picasso, Braque, all the artists who were living at that point of time in Paris. And for Cubism, Cézanne's works were also very important. And if you look at Cézanne actually analyzed the world, analyzed the nature, analyzed the forms of nature through a sort of a geometric approach, right? He saw nature in terms of square, sphere, cylinder, right? Cylinder, sphere, and square. So he sort of reduced everything into those basic geometric forms. And here what you see very close to Cézanne is that you have a bridge over there. It's a viaduct. It's sort of a water on the top portion, and what you have in the bottom is this houses, but houses are sort of reduced to this geometric basics of triangular, rectangular shapes, or arrangement of triangular and rectangular shapes, right? So by looking at it, one of the critiques, Louis Leroy, actually lamented that this looks like cubes, a bunch of cubes. From there, the artists have adopted the name Cubism for this movement. Remember, from Impressionism onwards, artists were not actually giving names to their movements. It is the critics or the public were mentioning in passage or just commenting, and from those comments these artists were taking the names, right? Like Impressionism, now Cubism, and also we can see Fauvism later. So he said a bunch of cubes, then from there the artists have used that name cubes into Cubism, right? So this is a painting that he did in 1908, and you can see the reduction of naturalism. What you see in nature is not entirely painted, but you are sort of manipulating, you are sort of recomposing the nature in your work. So there is a sense of analysis, there is an approach of analysis of pictorial space and nature in the pictorial space through a sort of an understanding of cubistic language, right? So now let us look at this slide on the next slide. This is a painting by Cézanne, and you see the same kind of a color combination that Braque was using and the same approach to nature. Cézanne never actually documented as he saw, but he sort of recomposed, he sort of reinterpreted nature according to his own viewpoint. And Cézanne also used multiple angles to paint one thing, and you can see multiple still lifes that he painted. He painted 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗍 some over 30 times. So you can see whenever he painted an apple, for example, he painted apple 100 times. So when he paint apple, it is not that he is seeing the apple and painting, but the knowledge of the apple from one angle helps to paint it from another angle, or the knowledge of 𝗧𝗦𝗔𝗍 from one angle helps to paint from the other angles if you paint over 30-40 times, so you know how it looks from the other side. So what happens is, here it is not about you look at nature and paint, but you paint from your own mind, right? You carry some memory and you paint. So that later, when it comes to Cubist movement, it became an experimentation with multiple perspective, right? It is the knowledge of multiple perspectives that are combined together in one painting, right? So in the next slide that you see, it is a face, right, head of a woman by George Braque, 1909, and here you can see he is sort of manipulating the head with a sort of a geometric rendering, right? And he is doing it, you can see that the nose is painted from the profile, from the side, and the eyes appear to be painted from the front, and you can see cheeks are painted both from the front as well as from the side, right? So this multiple perspectives are combined together in one portrait or one head, and this is a character of Cubist language, right? And Cubism has two, Cubism can be divided into two categories according to the time, that is from 1907 to 1912, it is analytical Cubism, right? And from 1912 to 1914, when the First World War broke and Cubism ended, 1914, that is called the synthetic Cubism, right? So keep those things in mind. So the next painting is by Picasso, and this is very close to what one can see in the African sculpture. This is nude. You can see several nudes being painted by different artists, but here Picasso is stylizing it with the help of or the influence from the African sculpture, right? Nude with raised arms. And if you look at African sculpture, you can see such kind of postures, right? So you can see a sort of a stylization, very strong outline, and it is not very well modeled. It is not the idea of modeling here, but the formal shape is very important at this point of time in this context, and the wide open eyes. So you see a sense of primordial charge can be seen in this particular painting, and you have several paintings like this by Picasso. And the next painting you see here is, it is very simple, where nude in the forest, but here the nude that is walking towards you is being stylized in a sort of a geometric rendering, a sort of a faceting. You see the thighs are not shown round, but they are shown in a sort of a division of facets into different facets. So it's more cubistic, right? So it's more geometric an approach, so which is why it is called Cubism. And the sense of light is very much there, unlike the earlier painting. He is again trying to come back to modeling from the earlier painting. So the next slide, the one that you see now, is a portrait of Ambroise Vollard. Ambroise Vollard was a patron and was a very important person at that point of time, who was encouraging the artist Pablo Picasso. So this is painted in 1910. What you see here is a very confusing sort of an image. It is not painted from one angle. As you can see here, he is using multiple angles, and he is reducing the form into different facets, and he is juxtaposing those facets. For example, the eye is seen from the side as well as from the front and from different angles, and all those angles are used in this painting, in painting the eye. So the multiple perspectives are painted and used to paint, and same with the nose or the head. So what happens is, you get a sort of a sculptural resolution to painting, right? It is not one particular angle. So it is an approach of analysis of form, and which is why it is called analytical Cubism. You don't paint the object that you see in front of you, but you analyze it by looking at it from different angles and combining those angles together in one painting. So, after analytical painting in 1912, Picasso experimented with this kind of an image that you see on the screen. This image, which is called still life, and from the beginning, Cubism, the artists in Cubism have painted lots of still lifes, and here for the first time he has used a foreign material, which is the printed paper, like the gift wrapping papers that we have now, the same kind of a paper, but here it is a chair caning. The chair caning that you see here is actually the printed paper, the chair caning printed on the paper, and he is using that. So, it is the first painting, experimental sort of a painting, where he used a foreign material, not just oil, but he is using a material which is very unconventional, which had never been used before. So, from this time onwards, from this painting onwards, you see collage emerges as a different practice, and this particular painting is also designed in a different way. It is not square, it is not rectangle, it is oval, right. So, the composition is very different, and he is framing it with the robe, right, very unconventional, and for the first time you see text is being used. So, you have a still life. When you look at the drawing, still life placed on this chair caning. The chair caning is not actually painted, but it is a paper, it is a printed paper, and you have this text used called 𝗳, and he uses 𝗳, journal, urnal, like that, where 𝗳 is, it suggests journey, right. So, here the text makes the image flat, right. When you write something, it becomes flatter, it suggests that this is a flat surface. So, Cubism is the movement which makes the pictorial space flat, right. So, it makes painting true to its character, in the sense the painting is a flatter surface, it is a surface into which you create ambiences, but what Cubism does is it reminds the viewer that this is the flat surface, and that happens with this painting in 1912. So, continuing with the last image that you saw, he went into, Picasso as well as Braque went into this synthesizing forms, not analyzing anymore, but combining different materials and making images. So, this slide that you see on your screen is a collage. He is using paper, and he is cutting paper and then creating an image out of papers, right. So, this is the kind of collage that continues later, and this is what is happening here is not anymore analysis of the form, but the form, there is no form, but the form is composed, is constructed by using different materials. So, form is synthesized. So, which is why it is categorized as synthetic cubism. And quickly moving on to the next slide. So, after making these collages, what happens is gradually Picasso, because he was using different materials, not just paper, he started cutting cardboards and trying to construct things like this. This is a guitar, but it looks like a sculpture, right. So, it is not like modeled from three different angles, but this is a very unique method of constructing a sculpture, right. So, he used different materials. This he used sheets, tin sheets. He had cut tin sheets almost like paper, but he did not kind of paste them on one planar surface, but he arranged them into a sort of a sculptural form, right. So, this is one of the unique ways of making sculptures at this point of time, and this also impacted the understanding of modernist sculpture, right. So, this is a very unique and a very new way of approaching sculpture that is introduced by a painter, Picasso. He never did sculpture. So, later he started doing sculpture also, but this is a sort of a sculptural resolution of painting or painting flowing into sculpture. So, you can see two different sort of things combined together in this kind of a work that you see here. So, moving on to the artists, there were several artists like Boccioni, Giacomo Balla, Umberto Boccioni and Carlo Carrà. So, this is Boccioni that you see on the slide, on the screen. This is called the City Races. So, what you see here is the movement, and two important aspects of futurism is movement, right. So, they understood in terms of kinetic movement, right. So, kinesthesis and synesthesis, right. So, kinesthesia and synesthesia, right. So, kinetic is what is movement, right, kinetic energy, movement. So, they wanted to capture the world in motion, right. So, in their paintings also what you see is they try to represent the movement. So, here it is the movement of the people in the city, and as the city raises, that was the time of revolution, not revolution, but the sort of mass movements that were happening in the cities. So, and you also should keep in mind that 1914 is the First World War, the beginning of First World War, and before the First World War, European cities were really not very peaceful, right. They could sense that war is going to come. So, people were really sensing the danger, and so this could be sensed in this. And but look at the way the painting is done, where you have a movement raising from the center, you have figures moving diagonally, there is a lot of dynamism. So, dynamism is very important when it comes to futurism, dynamic movement, and speed, dynamism and kinetic movement, all these are very much close to the scientific evolution also, right. Science also advocates this speed and movement. So, next slide is of Carlo Carrà. Again you can see same kind of a treatment of the forces are moving, and this is about the funeral of the anarchist 𝗂𝗽. Anarchist 𝗂𝗽 was attacked, was captured, and this is that moment. So, you can see the forces are coming from either sides, and you can see that movement that is coming, and you have the figure of the anarchist right in the center, but not moving, it's static. So, futurism is a sort of it adds movement to, let us say, cubism. What cubism did is it analyzed the object into multiple facets. You have bottle is being analyzed into multiple angles and multiple facets. What futurism does is futurism adds movement to it, right. So, you have the same geometric sort of effect, the geometric shapes. The geometric shapes are given some movement and kinetic energy when it comes to futurism, right. So, which is why you see they look more cubistic because they got influenced by cubism, but they have added movement. And in the slide, the next slide that you see is of Giacomo Balla. This is dog on a leash. So, what you see here is the dog walking and the woman walking and the chain moving. So, this is more about movement. It is not about the dog or the woman, but it is capturing the movement of the dog, how the dog is walking, and you can see how the very way the painting could be done is reinvented, right. So, the observation of nature is entirely different now. It is no more like the Impressionist painted or Post-Impressionist painted, but what you are seeing and how to capture that, because the dog is not static, how can you capture that into your painting? So, you needed to expand the way you paint, right, the way you capture a moving dog, right. So, all the legs, so you can see the movement of legs topwards and inwards, outwards and inwards, and the movement of chain. So, okay, so this is more about movement rather than the object. So, the object in motion is the important preoccupation of futurists. So, how were they getting this particular visual understanding? They were influenced by the chronographs that were produced at that point of time and the photographs. Okay. So, you have a very important photographer 𝗬𝗏𝗎𝗍𝗔𝗻𝒃. 𝗬𝗏𝗎𝗍𝗻𝒃 was experimenting with the chronophotograph, sorry. Chronophotograph is nothing but chrono means time, photograph is photograph, right. So, it is a combination. So, a photograph, an object is photographed when the object is moving. Here man jumping off stool, right. So, a man jumping off stool. So, you can see in one image a man on the stool, the movement of jumping and then on landing on the ground, right. The entire movement is captured in one particular image of the photograph. So, this is chronophotograph, and these experimentation were happening and these photographic images were available to the artists, and futurists and the painters, futurist painters have used these as influences, as visual examples, and you can compare this with the earlier painting, the dog leash, and you can understand how the visual influences are coming from the photograph, right. So, the next image is of Umberto Boccioni. This is a sculpture. He did sculpture as well as painting. This is called Unique Forms of Continuity in Space. So, you can see here the figure is been sort of remodeled, rearranged almost in different facets, in different flat facets, but the figure is moving here. It is not just one single anatomical body, but the anatomical body is sort of rearranged with the cloth, with the movement, and what is emphasized here is this movement where the figure is moving forward, and this idea of movement also has something attached with it, which is called progress. Moving forward and the idea of progress are combined together. So, we have seen futurism, we have seen cubism. Now, let us look at something very different, which is called Fauvism. In 1906, there was an exhibition in Paris where a group of artists came together and they started working and they exhibited in 1906. And after those paintings were seen by a critic, and he remarked that these are like wild bees. He said fauves among, he said Donatello among fauves, which is wild bees. Why he made this phrase, why he remarked this phrase, the Donatello among fauves, is there was an exhibition, the salon actually. In that salon you have Donatello's sculpture right in the center. So, Donatello's sculpture in the center, and you have these paintings by the Fauvist artists. So, with that remark, which is called fauves and which means wild bees, these artists have taken that name. Like Cubism, these artists have taken that name and then used for their group. Their group was short-lived, but what they did was really important. They sort of liberated color from their natural coordinates, right. So, if you look at this slide, what you see here is, for example, yellow for the sky, right, and you have blues used for the bodies, you have pinks. This is called Luxury Common Pleasure, painted in 1904 by Henri Matisse. Henri Matisse was the leader of this particular group called Fauvists, and they celebrated life. They did not go for machinery, but they celebrated life and the luxury of life. And what Fauvism did, like following Gauguin, what Fauvism did is they liberated the color from the natural coordinates, which is, for example, if you look at tree, a tree is green in color, but a Fauvist painter can paint red leaves. A Fauvist painter can paint yellow sky, right. So, the natural colors of natural objects were sort of liberated, were removed in the painting, and they have used different kinds of paintings to create, to enhance emotional experience, right, to create different visual effects. So, and emotional and psychological experiences, right. So, look at the next slide. which is called Portrait of Mother 𝗲𝗧. It is the wife of Henry 𝗲𝗲, and this is called Portrait of Mother 𝗲𝗧 with a green line, because if you look at it, the portrait is painted with multiple colors, and you have a green patch right on the forehead and on the nose, which is very challenging, because if you know, green color and blue color are colors that are receding colors, you know, they are not colors that come forward like red, right. So, green colors are receding colors, and it is a challenge here 𝗲𝗲 took, that you know, if you look at the face, this is the portion that is more coming forward, more protruded, right. So, for that most protruded part of the face, 𝗲𝗲 is using the green patch. So, he is using the color that takes your eye in, it is receding color, and he is using that for the most protruded part of the face. So, it was the kind of challenge that he was taking in terms of the color. So, if you look at the way it is painted, very remarkable, very stark outline. You have the face is divided into two sides. The left side is more greenish yellow, the other side is bluish sort of tints, and you have the background is divided into these color areas, and you have the red ground, the foreground is filled with the red garment. So, what you see here is he is not using the natural colors, he is using multiple colors, different colors for the face, but not the flesh tint. And this is the effort, this is the language of Fauvism, right. And let us move to the next slide of Henry 𝗲𝗲. This painting is called Blue Nude, and you see again he is using blue for the nude. He is not using the flesh tint, but he is using blue as the color for the body, for painting the flesh tone, and it is placed in the somewhere landscape, in the nature, you know. So, this is a painting which is very unusual, because the way the nude is posed is very different. It is unlike the nudes that we have seen earlier in the history of art. So, this particular pose comes from the sculpture that he was looking at, the African sculpture particularly, right. And this nude is also very much influenced from the African sculpture. So, what Fauvism did to painting in the early 20th century was it liberated the color from the natural coordinates of painting. Cubism liberated the form, right. You are no more painting the bottle as it is, but you are analyzing and rearranging it. Here color is liberated, you are not painting the color that you see in nature, but you are painting what you want to paint, what you feel like paint, what kind of emotional experience that you want to give. It is more about the emotional temperament rather than the naturalistic representation. So, what one can see in these efforts is it is not about representing nature, but the painting, the art practice moves away from its reliability on nature, from its link with nature, from its relation with nature. It moves away, and the artists, you know, have tried to invent new ways of painting, where the painting becomes a complete form in itself, a complete object in itself, right. So, let us move to the next art movement called Expressionism. Expressionism is called German Expressionism because it emerged in Germany, and there were two groups. One is Die Berg, another Der Blue Richter. Die Berg is nothing but the bridge, Der Blue Richter is nothing but the Blue Rider. So, the bridge and the Blue Rider, these were two groups. If you look at the bridge group, the Die Berger, Die Brugg group sought to convey raw emotion. So, you have Fauvism creating certain space for emotion, Expressionism also, but Expressionism is more intense, it is more provocative. So, they wanted to create the raw emotion and through provocative images of modern society. And to create that raw emotion, they distorted forms. The forms became very jarring and not very pleasing. right. So the pigments were also unnatural, like they didn't use naturalistic colors, they used different kinds of colors to create an emotional response in the viewer, right. So a primitive, a reductive aesthetic, a revival of older media and medieval German art, right. So they also fallen back on the printing technology, and they have revived woodcut, particularly the woodcut printing, and you can see many artists started using woodcut printing after German expressionists using. So graphic techniques were very important for them, and woodcut actually gives that jarring primitive effect to the image, right. So they started around 1906, 1907, and they started in Dresden, and then they moved to Berlin in 1911. So almost all these artists were not exactly trained as artists, but they were designers, they were architects, they were different kinds of visual practitioners, right. So the founding members shared a communal approach. As I said, this coming together was again very important. So they shared a communal approach which included sharing a studio, painting and taking holidays together, right. And like Van Gogh did with Gauguin, like the early Impressionists did, right. Gauguin and tribal art also, they encountered Dresden Ethnological Museum. In the Dresden Ethnological Museum, they have found many. So let us look at the images now. This is an image by Ludwig Kirchner. He was a part of the Bridge group. So this is basically the artist of the Bridge group. You have the members of the group. But look at the way he's painting the figures. The figures doesn't look very naturalistic. They are exaggerated. They are angularly painted. The color is very unnaturalistic. You have blue faces. You have blue ambiences. So what you see here is again very similar to Fauvism, but here they wanted to create this emotional intensity, and which is why the kind of distortion of the figures, the exaggeration of the forms, as well as the liberation of color. The color is used in a way which is very unnaturalistic, right. So another painting by Kirchner is this Berlin street. Again you can see same kind of exaggerated forms, very mask-like expressions, very unnaturalistic expressions, and this shows a kind of the modern culture of the streets, you know, the urban context of Berlin, where you see the woman in the front is wearing, you know, very lavish sort of clothes. She is fashion intensive, and this looks like as if it is mask like, right. So this doesn't look like naturalistic, right. So here Kirchner is actually trying to satirically represent the reality that he was seeing on the streets, the urban reality, right. So let us move to the other painting called by another artist, Rotloff. He is called Carl Schmidt Rotloff, and this is Houses at Night, and you can see the same logic, the liberation of color. The forms are exaggerated, they look distorted, and they are used, the distortion and the exaggeration is used along with the application of color to create this intense emotional movement, which is more or less disturbing sort of movement, right. So now let us look at some of the prints, right. So you have one print here I brought, which is by Erich Heckel. Erich Heckel was a very important printmaker, and this particular print that you see is a print from a folio of 11 woodcuts, and you can see the kind of exaggeration, the kind of the agony, the sort of pain. And remember, this is the time of First World War, right. So the kind of pain and the kind of disturbance that were existing at that point of time, you can see reflected in the woodcuts, and this is one of the example. And this is called Siblings, and you have families torn apart during this war. you have people died but families torn apart, you have brothers, sisters and parents really got disconnected, they moved apart because of the war, and this is a reflection of that, the intimacy. It's a sort of a response, a comment on that kind of a reality. So let us quickly look at Kandinsky and other artists of the Blue Rider group. This is an early painting by Kandinsky where you can see he is painting in a more free manner. It's a sort of a street autumn in Bavaria where he is using color in a liberated manner, more like a Fauvist, but the color is more like an post-impressionist or impressionist impasto, but also the color is liberated. But you can see the patches of color and the effect of light, which is very much like the post-impressionist, the impressionist sort of an engagement, street painting, but the light and the impasto color, more closer to the impressionist sort of effect, but also as an influence of Fauvism could be seen. And from this kind of a painting, he moves into abstraction, and he is the first abstract painter. And this example, this is one of the early examples of his shift towards abstraction. So you can see here that the forms are merged into each other, though you have an elephant right in the center, but the elephant is not very clear. The forms appear to be merging into each other, and the lines and the pictorial areas become more clear in themselves. They are not making a sort of a landscape or a sort of a clear image, but they are getting more and more abstract. And the next image that you see is the first abstract painting, and this is done by Kandinsky. What you see in this painting is nothing but the application of lines and color, and this is a watercolor, and he was very much influenced and in dialogue with Wagner, who was a classical musician. So music was something that influences Kandinsky apart from the theosophy, apart from the theology. So the spiritual philosophy of the East as well as the music comes together in his painting, and this is one of the examples which is called Improvisation 7. Improvisation is the title given, or is the title given to improvisation and the number, or the title given to the music pieces, if you know. So the next slide is of Franz Marc. This Franz Marc is the artist who painted animals extensively, and so sitting in the urban life in the center of Germany, Munich actually, he was painting animals, and through animals he was trying to reflect upon the agony, the violence of the human society. And the next artist that you see is Paul Klee. Paul Klee again was very much philosophical, influenced by Kandinsky. He went into a more subtle, geometric sort of abstraction. So he was influenced by child art, and child art becomes a very important preoccupation. It becomes a category at this point of time, and Paul Klee wanted to paint like a child, so which is why he sort of paints, his paintings look like as if they are painted by child, and they look naive. And he is the artist who almost invented new kinds of pigments, new kinds of hues. And the last artist is August Marc. August Marc also continues with the abstract sort of treatment, and you can see here the influence from Futurism and Cubism, but he's also very much influenced by the music and the way he's using geometric forms in a more repetitive manner. And this painting that you see, bathing girls with town in the background, where you have a more sort of a cubistic, futuristic combination, but also a sort of a Fauvistic sort of impression in this. So what we have seen now is a group, several art movements, and how through these art movements the modern art has emerged, as something that which is reflecting the modern society and the modern times. Thank you.